Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Today we're going to tackle the question, why does my mix sound bad? Now, if you've been following me for a while, you might be twitching a little bit thinking he's going to say get it right at the source, and I'm not. We're going to assume that we're starting with good tracks, okay? For this video, we're going to assume the tracks already sound good because we can absolutely still ruin these tracks if we don't mix them well. I've been in the unique position over the years of mixing songs and then having other people mix those same songs, and I'm able to hear all the different results. So I know how good the tracks sound, I know what kind of a mix is possible, and then I hear how other people achieve their mixes. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're terrible. And as you can imagine, over the years of doing that and doing mix critiques and all of that, I've developed a bit of a vocabulary and different categories of the different types of bad mixes out there. And today we're going to listen to examples of those and give you some suggestions on how to avoid them. So my goal for you today is for you to identify which of these types of bad mixes are you most susceptible to, and some ways to avoid them. A big issue that we all run into when we're learning how to mix is we don't really have a goalpost, right? We just pull up some tracks and we just start adding stuff, and we're not sure what sound we're trying to achieve. We just kind of keep putting stuff on there and think, I guess that sounds better. I don't know. Then we go listen to our favorite record and think, oh, it doesn't sound anything like that. Where did I go wrong? And it's hard to know because there's so many variables at play. So I'm going to try to simplify that for you a little bit, help you identify where your problem areas are, so then you can start addressing them and actually start making some traction and some progress in your mixes. Sound good? Okay. Here's the session I've put together. This is one of my songs, one of my mixes, and we'll start with just a nice cleansing listen to the finished actual mix. Then we'll go through and listen to a bunch of the bad mixes. Okay, here we go. Is it the best mix in the world? No, but I'm happy with that mix and it works well on a lot of different systems, so we're going to use it. So the first area that I think people fall into, the first category of bad mixes, is setting bad levels. By the way, I'm using the new mix scenes feature inside of Studio One that lets me save different versions of mixes so it can change the plugins and the levels. It's pretty great. Bad levels. So I talk about how one of the most important first steps in a mix is setting the levels and getting a good static mix. A lot of people will nod their head in agreement, but then they'll go off and add plugins way too soon. You got to get a good level, right? You have to set the levels where everything is at the right volume before you start adding plugins, or the plugins will be trying to solve problems that could have been solved by just getting the levels right. So oftentimes within the first few seconds of a mix, I can tell if the levels were wonky before the person ever started adding plugins. So here's an example of a out of balance bad level mix.
I know I can hear you, I know you can hear me, all of this noise.
It's uncomfortable. So the tone of the vocal's not bad, but the vocal's way too loud, the bass is way too loud, and I can barely hear the drums and the guitars and the other instruments. Listen one more time, I'll turn it down a little bit.
I know I can hear you.
So we can all agree, vocals and bass too loud, drums and everything else too quiet. What people will do is they'll hear that and they'll say, I can't hear the drums very well. Let me go compress them more. Or I can't hear, or the bass is too loud. Let me EQ it to make it less loud. And they're not saying that out loud, but that's what they're trying to do, is maybe compress or EQ to get it to sit where it needs to sit. When the solution was to just hold your horses and take a few more minutes to set the levels. Get the drums at a nice loud volume that balances with the bass well, versus kind of trying to fix and polish this turd sitting in front of us. All right, the second type of bad mixes, I mentioned this already, muddy mixes. Okay, this is a big issue that, for me at least, it was kind of the first stop in my journey of bad mixes, where I was just, everything had too much low mid range. So when I say low mids, I mean from like 100 hertz up to 300 or so. In that kind of, it's where a lot of the warmth of the mix is, but if there's too much information there, if you don't handle it well, things just sound muddy, can sound like this. So we can hear the high frequencies, right? But we're also just getting overwhelmed with low mid. So everything's just kind of blah. It doesn't have any clarity. It's kind of sort of muffled sounding, even though muffled is a different type of bad mix we'll get to in a second. It's just there's too much in that low mid range. The solution here is to make sure on those mid-range heavy instruments, which are a lot actually, guitars, bass, drums, vocals, keyboards, I mean, they really all have a significant amount of information in that low mid-range. Make sure there's not too much of it there, right? If we're thinking about it visually from an EQ standpoint, make sure those low mids, there's not a big hump in the low mids that's causing everything to sound muddy. Real quick tip, that also can happen in the reverb. Sometimes reverbs are the source of muddiness, which is why I always have an EQ on my reverbs to roll off that low end. All right, next type of mix. This is what happens when you try to say, I'm never going to have a muddy mix again, so you end up overcompensating and you take out all the mids, low mids especially. And what you end up with is, you may have heard people talk about the smiley face EQ curve. It's what people used to do with their stereos, maybe you still do, where they would bring they had that graphic EQ, and they would pull down the mids and push up the lows and the highs to make it this nice smiley shape. I don't know who started it, but I wish they hadn't. It's not great for mixes. We need mid-range. Mid-range is wonderful. It's amazing. Yes, it's problematic, but it's also necessary for our mixes to sound normal. Listen to this mix. It's got that smiley curve, and it just sounds hollow in the middle. So we might initially think, oh man, that's too bright, let's turn the highs down. Actually, the problem is there's just no mids, there's no warmth to warm that up. The way I achieved this sound actually was I just took some of the mid-range out of the entire mix, and listen to how harsh it sounds. That's interesting, right? I took frequencies out and it made you hear other frequencies more. That's one of the mysteries of mixing. Let those mids be there. Let them have a right balance. Not too low, not too high, but just right in the middle, and your mixes will start to sound better. All right, let's talk about harsh mixes. This is similar to hollow, but it's where folks, I would put the boostaholics in this category. The folks who just love to grab an EQ and boost frequencies. They say, I want that vocal to be brighter, so they go whoosh, and they push the high EQ up as high as it'll go. This also tends to be folks, I say this delicately, in the older age range. So here's a fact. When you get older, most people start to lose their hearing, especially in the upper frequencies. So it's as if your hearing has like a low pass filter that just slowly, as you get older, rolls out some of the highs. You need to be aware of that because your instinct might be, well, these don't sound very bright. So you crank up the EQ so that it sounds bright to you, but to the rest of us, it sounds too bright, okay? Go listen to your favorite albums. Do they sound a little muffled to you? Then your mixes probably need to sound a little bit muffled to compensate for the fact that you're not hearing those high frequencies super well. I am not trying to be elitist. I will be there one day and we'll have to deal with it. But it's a reality. I've had folks who send me mixes, and when they're super bright, if I say, hey, this is one of the reasons why it might be bright, they'll say, yeah, that's it. I played guitar too loud for too many years. I don't hear high frequencies super well. So you got to learn to compensate for that. And that means don't make it as bright as you can if you know that your ears are dulling things. So here is a example of a harsh mix. We won't listen to this for long because it is painful. It's all highs and high mids, and you're losing the mids and the low end. It's just, they're not there. And some of the problem can also be if you have speakers or headphones that are really dark, you're boosting things in the mix to make it sound a little brighter in your ears, but the reality is the mix is now overly bright and harsh, okay? All right, muffled. This isn't as big of an issue, but I'll find this to me, when I hear things that are muffled, it usually means the recording wasn't great. But occasionally folks will just, a combination of, well, let's just listen to it and then I'll talk about it. So this example is where folks are maybe maybe they've gone too far in the harsh direction. They're trying to make a warmer sounding mix. So they're taking high frequencies down, right? To a fault, to the point where there's no clarity, there's no brightness there at all. I tend towards warmer mixes generally. Sometimes. But that means I can sometimes err on the side of making things too dark, which means leaving too much lows and low mids and taking out a little too much of the high frequencies, and it can start to sound muffled. Like the voice can sound like, it really sounds like you put a wool sock over the entire mix and it just doesn't have the clarity that it could have. And you might initially think that sounds fine, but let's go back to the original mix. This is the kind of clarity you want. Still has low mid-range and warmth, still has bass, but all the top end is still there as well. We have kind of equal parts of each. Not equal, but balanced. All right, and the final one, this is one of the most common. Folks just get compressor happy and they compress the crap out of everything. So mixes then sound over compressed. Now the reason for that, it could be a combination of things, like you didn't have good levels at first, then you wanted to compress to fix the bad levels, or you didn't EQ things well and so they're muddy, and then when you compress muddy things it causes all kinds of gross sounds. Whatever the case may be, if you find yourself using lots of compression on lots of tracks and you're not happy with your mixes, which you're probably not, then you need to ease up on that compression. Here's what overcompressed sounds like. See if this sounds familiar. All right, let's talk about what we're hearing here. One of the easiest places to hear it is on the drums. When the drums start hitting, it should sound like but instead it sounds like these huge cymbals go nuts and come out, and everything almost has a distorted sound to it. And then every other track kind of has the same thing. The mix is pumping, there's this kind of distorted sound, everything sounds like it's being strangled. Now I like compression. I want there to be compression on lots of things, but when there's too much compression on too many things and you use really fast attack and really fast release in too many situations, you end up with something that sounds like this. I mean, just listen to each kind of, as it plays, listen to the drums, listen to the vocals and the guitars, and how they all just sound kind of unnaturally hindered by how much compression we have. So there you go. There are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of bad mixes and how you get there. Now, just reverse engineer what we've talked about today and go improve your mixes. Which one do you fall into? Leave a comment and let us know. And then go and make some of these changes. If you're a muddy mix kind of person, let's ease up on some of those low mid frequencies. If you're an overcompression person, let's just pull back on the compressor and only compress a handful of things, or maybe nothing for a while, until you can get a great sounding mix with just EQ and levels. And then let's add some compression. If your stuff is always way out of balance, spend some time just with faders and no plugins. Like spend an hour just setting those levels. Make it sound as good as you can. Then add some EQ and some compression. Always be a little more light-handed than you want to be if you tend to overdo things, and we all do. It's just kind of the natural progression. If you want to learn more about mixing, I have a new mixing course that you would love. It shows basically how to avoid all of these problems by having a system in which to kind of wrap your mixing in, whether you're mixing 2 tracks or 200. Okay, not 200, but like 40 or 50, you need a process for either. And I've got a process that works no matter what you're mixing, helps you know how to start the mixes, how to set them up, how to approach them, how to know which parts to address next, and then finally how to know when your mix is finished. It's a great program. You can check it out at homestudiocorner.com/mix. All right, that's it from me. Thanks for watching. See you next week.